Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to the season finale of Urban Legends and Mythology. And let me tell you, I am really pumped for this. It has been 3 seasons. And in those 3 seasons, this show has been listened to in 36 countries by over 2,000 people across almost every streaming platform there is. Hell, it's even streaming on platforms I didn't even know existed until it showed up in my analytics. And for that, I just want to truly, from the bottom of my heart, say thank you. You listeners, you members, whatever, you guys make this all possible with your support. To be honest, if I didn't have your support, I wouldn't be doing this. But I have a great episode for you today. This is a trip to hell. We are talking about it all in this episode. Satan, the devil, Satanism, satanic cults, the satanic panic of the 80s, hell, heavy metal music. We are going hard in this one. It's going to be awesome. But enough with the introduction. Let's start where we always do, right at the beginning. So, Satan, or the devil, he primarily shows up in the Abrahamic religions. And I'm taking this first part straight from the Wikipedia article because I'm lazy, so feel free to follow along. So, Satan, aka the devil, and sometimes called Lucifer, is an entity in the Abrahamic religions that seduces humans into sin or falsehood. In Judaism, he's seen as kind of like a lawyer figure. He's subservient to God, and he's a metaphor for evil inclination. And in Christianity and Islam, he's usually seen as a fallen angel or a jinn who has rebelled against God, who nevertheless allows him temporary power over the fallen world and a host of demons. And in the Quran is actually where we get that idea of him as an entity made of fire who was cast out of heaven because he refused to bow before the newly created Adam, and he incites humans to sin by inflicting their mind with evil suggestions. So we get the general gist of it. In those religions, he's like the big bad guy, the evil entity, the anti-god or whatever. And without getting too deep into it, he originally shows up in the Hebrew Bible as kind of like this lawyer type figure who tests the allegiance of Yahweh or God's human followers. And by the time we get around to like Zoroastrianism and Christianity and all that stuff, he's basically been rewritten or recast as this malevolent entity that reigns over hell. He's usually identified as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and in the Synoptic Gospels, he's the one who tempts Jesus in the desert, and he's identified as the cause of illness and temptation. And in the book of Revelation, he appears as the great red dragon who is defeated by Michael the archangel and is cast down from heaven, who is later bound for 1,000 years but briefly set free before being ultimately defeated and cast into the lake of fire. He's the ultimate rebel, the ruler of hell. For some, he is a symbol of virtue and liberty, and for a vast majority of others, he is a symbol of the evils which overtake your life when you leave the church or stray from the church doctrine. But at the end of the day, all of us in the Western world here have a fairly good idea of what the devil is and what he's ultimately supposed to represent. He's supposed to represent the rejection of God in the Judeo-Christian Islam sense. So now that we know who he is and where he kind of comes from, let's dig into this infamous figure and see why he holds such a huge stranglehold on most people today, because he appears in fiction, non-fiction, all kinds of different art, music, literature, film, even this episode of this dumb podcast. Hell, he's literally been worshipped by people. Religions have sprung up around him, cults, all kinds of crazy stuff. So let's really dive into some of that and see what's really going on here, because I think that story is more fascinating than the story of the biblical devil himself. Nobody cares about that story. We've heard it a billion times. Let's go down some more nuanced rabbit holes and try to figure this all out. So to be honest, we don't really see a lot of narrative or depictions surrounding surrounding the devil or Satan in early Christian theology. It's really not until about the late medieval period, around the 9th century, when depictions of Satan really start to show up in art. And a lot of these early depictions actually show him as reminiscent of some Indo-European gods and goddesses, one most notably being Pan. He was a Greek fertility god who had like goat legs. And the imagery of the devil's pitchfork actually comes from Poseidon's trident. And there were other obvious examples we can get into concerning his depictions, but the early Christians of this era, they were really good at taking these images of these other gods and saying, look, that god over there, he's actually a demon because he is what we see as Satan or the devil. And it's really in the High Middle Ages, around the year 1000 to about the year 1300, when he starts being depicted in pretty much all forms of European or Christian art. And he's really depicted in literature outside of biblical texts in the infamous Inferno by Dante Alighieri in the 1300s. And in this depiction, he appears as a giant demon frozen mid-breast in ice at the center of the ninth circle of hell. He has 3 faces, under which are a pair of bat-like wings, and in each mouth he gnaws forever on the bodies of Judas, Brutus, and Cassius, considered 3 of the greatest traitors of the human race, according to Dante Alighieri at least. Which this depiction of him in the center of hell being depicted as frozen in ice is really the old school traditional idea, because in that religion they believe that hell is this dark place that's absent of light because light is representative of their god. So without the light coming from God and being so far removed from God and not having that warmth of God's love or whatever, leaves you forever frozen and in darkness. And in fact, that modern version of the lake of fire, which we think of when we think of hell now, actually comes from the Egyptian idea of the afterlife. In ancient Egyptian religion, it appears as an obstacle on a journey through the underworld which can destroy or refresh the deceased. However, in Christianity, it was taken up as a punishment against those who rebelled against God or the Christian church. It's that old notion of believe what we believe or you're going to be tortured forever in this lake of fire, which actually doesn't even show up in Christianity until about the year 230 AD. But it becomes kind of the dominant view of hell that we have today, but I digress. So shortly after Dante's Inferno, he shows up in many of the Canterbury Tales. He then shows up in 1589 in Faust. Then he shows up in John Milton's Paradise Lost, where he's depicted in that traditional way as an angel. However, Paradise Lost is like a jerk-off fantasy tale. A lot of people call it the first true biblical fan fiction. And up until this point, he's really being portrayed as just mostly a literary device, a warning of what happens if you stray too far from the church or act rebellious or whatever. But coming out of the late medieval period and going into the Renaissance and the early modern periods, we see this obvious change in the character. He becomes more malevolent and more powerful than ever. And it's actually around this time where fear of the devil and the dark forces in the world are growing, and it kicks off one of the first satanic panics, which leads to things like the Inquisition and these various witch hysterias and witch hunts which flooded across Europe at this time. And before we dive too deep into those, the thing you have to realize about all these satanic panics and these witch hysterias is they all come from a feedback loop. And it's this same feedback loop that comes over and over again every time you look into these. So the first part is something bad happens, and the bad thing that happened can be one of the many travesties that happen throughout human history: a plague, a famine, a bad harvest, being on the losing end of a war or conflict, or from just something as simple as an unexpected, unexplained death. But the gist is, the first part is always there's something bad that happens. So what do you do when something bad happens and you're not intelligent enough to discern the cause? Well, you latch latch on to the quickest, easiest, simplest solution. Somebody or something caused this to happen. And then you start to speculate, well, who is this somebody or something that caused this to happen? Could have been one of those fringe society members who never shows up to church and usually squabbles with their neighbors. It could be that mysterious old woman who lives on the outskirts of the village and makes tonics and cures with random herbs. Or it could be a dark cabal of witches and these covens who have subserved themselves to Satan. The next thing you know, you have a full-blown witch hunt on your hands. And you and your group know exactly who to target. You target the outsiders, those who you perceive to be your enemies, those who do not conform to your religious views or have taken up practices which are antithetical to your religious views. And we've seen this happen over and over again throughout history. It really kicks off in England with King James I. James I was obsessed with witches and hunting witches. I mean, he even wrote Demonology, which he borrowed heavily from Malleus Maleficarum, but I digress. But he and those who would come to follow him create this panicked fear that the devil was influencing these women to stand at his altar and worship him and sow his chaos throughout the world and society. And in exchange, they would be given great powers, powers of healing, powers of clairvoyance. And if you really dig into the history, it seems like their sexual frustrations would finally be satisfied as well. And it wasn't always just women being targeted, it was other sects and breakaway sects in Christianity that would be targeted as colluding with the devil as well. I mean, take the Puritans. The Puritans took it to the extreme, especially with the Salem witch trials. And hell, even before that, at the beginning of the 17th century with the Pendle witch trials, which targeted this very impoverished family who were on the fringes of society. And it led to the deaths of several members of that family based on the testimony of like a 6-year-old girl who was obviously coached in her testimony, who had no clue that she was sentencing her own mother to death with her testimony. But that's a deep dive for another episode. But it seems at this point in the 16th, 17th centuries, the devil had transformed into a figure who you would sell your soul to in exchange for some kind of gift or power. However, it always came with an insidious lesson or a curse or something along those lines, and the end game was that you would burn forever in the lake of fire. You know, Faust was a pretty good depiction of this. In exchange for like 24 years of like pleasure and riches, he would sell his soul to the devil at the crossroads. And actually, this is the first time in history where it's depicted that somebody sells their soul to the devil at the crossroads. Get into that a little bit later. But the devil sends Mephistopheles, who basically hangs out and parties with them and uses his magical powers to give Faust whatever he wants, at the end of which his soul is eternally damned. And another good depiction of this story that comes later actually comes in the 19th century from the tale of Dorian Gray. As we recall, Dorian Gray, he's this extremely wealthy, extremely attractive young man who early in his life gets involved with these, let's just say, bohemians. They have kind of this club or this cult or whatever where they worship the pleasures of life. And early in the book, as Dorian realizes that he's starting to age, he actually chains his soul to the devil's altar in exchange for eternal youth and beauty. So the years and decades go by and he indulges in these sick fantasies and whatever, as his soul is visually represented in this painting that ages for him and bears the scars of a crazy life filled with debauchery and possibly, well, most likely syphilis. And what a lot of people forget is at the end, even while he tries to redeem himself, that painting is burned, and that painting is a depiction of his soul. And the burning of that painting at the end of the book is symbolic of his soul being dragged to hell to endure this punishment that he must endure for eternity. So this is kind of where we are post-Middle Ages, post-New Modern period, post-Enlightenment, post-19th century. We still have this depiction of the devil as this malevolent, evil entity, and he's taken on this trickster kind of personality that we see heavily from like the jinns in Islamic cultures. But now he's become become more of that symbol where you can get what you want in life if you turn your back on your God. And where this really shows up in prominence is in the music world. Now, depictions of the devil in music go all the way back to the late Middle Ages, early modern period. Now, one of the most famous instances of that comes from Giuseppe Tartini. Now, Tartini was this kind of Baroque era Italian composer and violinist, and he had actually composed over 100 pieces for the violin, many of them being violin concertos. However, his most famous piece of work is his Violin Sonata in G minor, also known as the Devil's Trill Sonata. And the legend states that the devil actually came to him in a dream and composed this for him. And he actually tells the story himself, written in his own words, on how this happened, and the story goes as follows. On one night in the year 1713, I dreamed I had made a pact with the devil for my soul. Everything went as I wished. My new servant anticipated my every desire. Among other things, I gave him my violin to see if he could play. How great was my astonishment on hearing a sonata so wonderful and so beautiful, played with such great art and intelligence as I had never even conceived in my boldest flights of fantasy. I felt enraptured, transported, enchanted. My breath failed me and I awoke. I immediately grasped my violin in order to retain part or at least the impression of the dream in vain. The music I at this time composed is indeed the best I had ever wrote, and I still call it the Devil's Trill, but the difference between it and that which so moved me is so great that I would have destroyed my instrument and have said farewell to music forever if it had been possible for me to live without the enjoyment it affords me. And I cannot help after reading that but to think of that infamous song by Tenacious D, Tribute. It kinda has a similar feel behind it. But what really thrusts the devil, Satan himself, into like the music genre, and it thrusts them into their heart and is responsible for later satanic panics, is in the early 1900s when jazz and blues became known as the quote devil's music, end quote. Primarily because these versions of secular music were considered unholy and devil-like. And this notion really comes from the like hardcore Christian South. Now, the most famous examples of the devil influencing the music in this early era come from Ike Zimmerman, Tommy Johnson, and Robert Johnson. These men were itinerant musicians in the late 1910s, early 1920s, and around this time when they're hearing this new sound, this jazz, this blues music, they decide to focus on that type of music, the popular music of the era. And the colloquial term in the South for doing this instead of just playing gospel-based music was he done gone went to the devil. Now, Ike Zimmerman, he was said to have honed his guitar skills supernaturally by playing in the graveyards at midnight, and both Tommy and Robert Johnson, no relation by the way, were both said to have sold their souls to the devil at the crossroads at midnight in order to become a great blues musician. Now, this story was originally attributed to Tommy Johnson, who was a blues performer throughout the 20s, and he actually lived until I think the 1960s. And if you've ever seen the film Oh Brother Where Art Thou, they do a really good job of depicting that legend was originally attributed to Tommy Johnson, who actually would come out and say it. Now, the legend does get attributed to Robert Johnson simply because he's part of that 27 Club, and his life is completely packed with mystery and legend, so the legend gets attached to him. And it's also because Robert Johnson was really instrumental in laying down the foundations that would become Delta blues and the earliest foundations of rock and roll, while unfortunately Tommy Johnson kind of faded into obscurity after the 1930s. And this is actually the third time throughout this entire podcast series that I am discussing this legend, but it's a legend I love, so here we go. I'm discussing discussing it again. So the legend goes that Robert Johnson, he was a notoriously bad guitar player. He just sucked at the guitar, but he loved the blues. He loved going to these juke joints and these bars and listening to these performers play, and he dreamed of being the greatest blues musician of all time. And people like the infamous legendary blues musician Son House, he would say, back then we would play a gig and he'd be hanging out, and then we'd go out to catch air, and then while we're out there taking a break, Robert would go over, he'd pick up one of the guitars and start playing, and he was so notoriously bad that people would throw beer bottles at him and tell him to get off the stage. But one night while he was staying on the Dockery plantation, he was told that if he go out to the crossroads at midnight during the full moon with his guitar, the devil himself would show up and turn him into a great guitarist. Now, we really don't know who told him this. Could have been Ike Zimmerman, could have been some voodoo priestess, we don't know. But he decides he's going to take this advice, so he waits for the next full moon, and it's this beautiful kind of summer night. There's a nice cool breeze in the air, and he starts walking out towards those crossroads. And just for context, the Dockery plantation is way out in the middle of nowhere, and these crossroads are dirt roads. So at precisely midnight, he makes it to the center of the crossroads, and he's standing there in the moonlight holding his guitar, when suddenly out of nowhere, a large black man suddenly appears in front of him. The man says nothing, he just motions for Tommy to hand him his guitar. He takes the guitar and strums a few chords. After this, the devil hands him back his guitar. He turns around without saying a word and disappears. But that was the agreement, that was the pact, and Robert Johnson would re-emerge in those juke joints months later. And as the regular house musicians were out catching air, Robert Johnson would take his guitar up on the stage, and suddenly, as if by some supernatural force, he was playing some of the best blues guitar you would ever hear in your life. Son House walked back to that stage, and he could not believe his eyes when he saw that the person playing that guitar so well was the infamous Robert Johnson, the boy who couldn't carry a note just mere months ago. And Robert Johnson went on to be the greatest Delta blues musician of all time. And if you want to hear his full life story, I actually did an entire episode about him and his life back in season 2, so go check that episode out. I also briefly touch on this legend at the end of the season 1 finale, the infamous 27 Club, so go check that one out as well. But the reason I return to this story is because of the devil's influence in music and how the devil is associated with rock and roll and contemporary music and heavy metal music, and I'm going to get all into that in this next segment right here. So it's really in the countercultures of the 60s during that post-beatnik hippie era when we start to see an emergence of more, we'll say, heavy forms of music, heavy forms of rock and roll and the earliest foundations of metal. It's also during this era when we start to see a rejection of those World War II McCarthyian era Christian American values. Those old school notions and ideas really start to break down with this new generation of boomers coming up. These people are more liberal-minded. They're more curious about the world outside of their own country. They're curious about other religions, particularly the religions of India. It's a really big influence on their counterculture. And to be honest, they are a lot more hedonistic than their parents and their grandparents. And a huge driving force behind this isn't just the new literature that's coming out at the time, it's the music, the popular music at the time. And with this shift, there was more satanic, devilish iconography going into this new art. For example, in the Rolling Stones hit song Sympathy for the Devil, Mick Jagger essentially takes on the role of the devil who boasts his role in each of the several historical atrocities which are being discussed in the song, and he repeatedly asks, "Can you guess my name?" It's a great piece of art, and it conveys a deep message, especially concerning the listener's culpability in these crimes of killing and mass shootings shooting and all this stuff that was going on that they were fighting against, racial inequality, the lynchings in the South, the Vietnam War, etc., etc. But it was quickly taken out of context, and a lot of more conservative or Christian listeners were saying, look at him, he's boasting that he is Lucifer. And then you had bands like Black Sabbath, who was really considered the first heavy metal band. They used a lot of dark iconography, which they actually mostly got from the film genre. And hell, even the very name of their band came from a horror film. It came from the horror film Black Sabbath. It was made in 1963 and it starred Boris Karloff. And it's actually kind of funny, up until then they actually were like a rock blues band and they weren't very popular. However, right across the street from where they would rehearse sometimes there was this theater, and this theater was showing the film Black Sabbath, and it was actually one of the band members who noticed that it seemed kind of strange that all these people were lined up to pay all this money to see a horror film. And from that initial observation, they get the idea, hey, we can make a lot of money and pull in a lot more fans if we just switch up to our own kind of horror genre. And the rest is history. Ozzy Osbourne goes on to become the infamous Prince of Darkness that we all know and love today. But it was funny because they said it was weird at first because they would do shows and they would get like actual people listening to their shows and coming to their shows who were like Satanists, and they actually would have to turn down gigs sometimes. One time they turned down a gig at Stonehenge because a lot of freaking Satanists would be there, and they just thought that was just too crazy, too weird even for them. However, they're another band that would get swept up in these emerging satanic panics, and Ozzy Osbourne would go on to actually be sued multiple times by these like weird, crazy watchdog groups because he would be blamed for his lyrics influencing teenagers to commit suicide, which unfortunately couldn't be further from the truth. But these notions come from a complete disregard of the meanings behind the songs and the context of the songs. They just look at the iconography and the types of groups that are listening to the music, and then they place the blame on the musicians. And this would carry out throughout the 80s and 90s in the music industry. Every time a new metal band or a new like shock rock band would come onto the scene, they would be called a bunch of Satan worshippers and instantly get the blame for anything that went bad or any kind of crime that happened in America. Judas Priest was said to be associated with Satan worship. Kiss and AC/DC were said to have been the music of the devil. Hell, people even think Michael Jackson was a devil worshipper. The big one that got all the flack throughout the 90s was Marilyn Manson. Everybody was convinced that he was a Satanist, and to this day people still blame him in that weird conspiracy theory that's connected to Columbine. They said that just because the kids happened to listen to Marilyn Manson that he was influential in that school shooting. But anybody who was alive then and actually remembers the actual context would realize that that was actually a result of those kids being bullied and misunderstood. But then again, back then, and I just know this because I was in school at this time, if someone was being bullied for being different or if they were depressed or whatever, they were just basically told to get over it. But the true fact of the matter is Marilyn Manson was never a devil worshipper. He was actually an atheist. It's pretty hard to worship the devil when you don't even believe that he exists. But he always gets a lot of flack, just like Ozzy Osbourne, because Christian groups just hate those guys for whatever reason. They don't follow that Christian norm, and they're easy targets. And to be honest, that whole idea of devil worship in the music industry still lingers to this day. It's wrapped up in that modern Illuminati QAnon conspiracy theory, which is basically just a modern day satanic panic. These people believe that artists like Beyonce or Taylor Swift or whoever you want, just insert artist here, are part of the satanic cult, and the only way they can make it in the music industry is to sell their soul when they sign their contracts with whatever record label they're associated with. And while that might sound crazy, there are people, like my ex-wife for example, who is a rational human being who actually believes that. However, when you actually dig into the history of the music during this era and previous eras and this influence of Satan in our music, there is literally zero evidence to suggest that it's true. The fact of the matter is because dark iconography sells records. It's what teenagers are attracted to. Of course, I always found it kind of ironic that the music industry is what really gets all the flack when it comes to satanic influence on our teenagers, while the film and television industries are completely ignored when it comes to these conspiracies, especially considering that when you really look into it, most of this iconography, most of these satanic panics, most of this so-called satanic influence actually comes from film and television. Yet we almost never see instances of these like self-appointed watchdog groups blaming film and television for any of this. It's always the music industry or something else. I also find it kind of ironic that despite all this hatred that the music industry gets, nobody ever tried to directly blame or sue the Beatles when it came out that Charles Manson and his cult scrawled the term Helter Skelter in blood during the Tate LaBianca murders. You know, there was no big satanic panic push to ban the White Album after that. However, Marilyn Manson one time in the 90s tears up a Bible on stage and they want to ban him outright for it. It's kind of ambiguous where some of these Christian watchdog groups will draw the line. But speaking of these crazy self-appointed Christian watchdog groups, the craziest thing they ever went after in the 1980s was Dungeons and Dragons. This game really set off a panic in the 1980s from worried mothers who didn't want their precious angels playing this demonic game, and it gets really unhinged. So for context, Dungeons and Dragons, for those few people out there who don't know, is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game. It was created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in 1974. And that's basically what it is. It's this fantasy game. It's this game where you and your team are the heroes and you're going out and you're embarking on these adventures to like save the princess or slay the dragon or whatever. You basically do whatever you want based on the story that the DM has created. And it's filled with like wizards and dwarves and elves and anything you can think of, I guess. But it was a popular game amongst, let's just say, nerds of the 1970s and 1980s, and it's really resurged in popularity in the last few years with the rise of shows like Stranger Things and whatnot where it's depicted. There are several YouTube channels now that are dedicated to it, so you got a general gist of the idea of the game. However, this innocent board game became a focal point in the emergent satanic panic of the 1980s. It was said to have promoted Satanism, witchcraft, suicide, pornography, and murder. It was said to be racist, and that if you played the game, you were participating in a satanic ritual to summon demons. So where does that all come from? Well, it all starts in 1979 with the disappearance of a 16-year-old named James Dallas Egbert III. So Egbert was born in Dayton, Ohio. He actually grew up in Hubert Heights, which a lot of firefighters call the perfect neighborhood because it's all these little brick houses. And this kid was like one of those genius child prodigies. He was at the Michigan State University at age 16, and he was majoring in computer science, so this was a smart kid. However, he was a kid who was suffering from depression and other psychological problems. A lot of it was brought on by like parental pressure to succeed, loneliness, and it was theorized that he was having difficulty coming to terms with his own homosexuality. And this being the 1970s, he wasn't getting any help for any of that. So on August 15, 1979, after writing a suicide note, he leaves his dorm and enters the university's steam tunnels where he consumes some methylaquilone. It's basically a sedative like a Quaalude. However, the suicide attempt fails and he goes into hiding at a friend's house. So he's not heard from for a few days because he actually goes to this like Dungeons and Dragons tabletop convention. And by August 22nd, after still not hearing from him, Egbert's parents hired a man named William Deere, who was a private investigator, so they can find out where the hell their son is and why they haven't heard from him. Now, from the first day of the investigation, Egbert's mother had informed Deer that he had possibly committed suicide, and she was upset because they hadn't informed him of his disappearance until 5 days after it happened. So Deer is investigating this disappearance, and during this investigation he finds out that the kid plays Dungeons and Dragons. And a lot of the students on campus, they say, well, the kids that play Dungeons and Dragons, they usually hang out in the steam tunnels and play it for whatever reason. So at this point, Deer, he goes down to the steam tunnels to investigate and figures the kid probably went down there to do a session and lost his way or got injured or something, and he's still stuck down there. However, by this time, this early in the investigation, the fact that he played D&D, like, the media took that and ran with it. And you know how the media are, they can't just report on the facts or the news that happened. They have to take the tiniest little detail that seems out there and just run with it with their crazy theories and hypotheses. Before you knew it, there were news stories going that it was this insidious, secretive cult, which the students were playing this game and it was by invitation only, and it was Dungeons and Dragons, and you can summon demons and worship Satan and all this other bullshit. However, the whole time this was going on, Egbert, he was hanging out at these two different houses, and then he takes a bus down to New Orleans. While he got there, and while still suffering from this mental illness and this depression, which was leading to suicide at this time, he attempts suicide again by taking a cyanide compound. This attempt also failed. He then moves on to Morgan City, Louisiana, where he finds employment as a laborer at an oil field, and on his fourth day of work there, he hears that the private detective William Deer was searching for him, and he actually telephoned Deer, revealed his location, and Deer traveled to Louisiana and recovered Egbert. So he's then released into the custody of his uncle, a man named Marvin Gross, on September 13, 1979, mostly because Egbert told Deer basically not to take him home. So after this, Egbert, he eventually transfers from Michigan State University to Wright State University, which was closer to home, where he continued to study computer systems, but he drops out in April of 1980. After that, he was working in an optical store run by his father. It is shortly after this, on Monday, August 11th, 1980, when Egbert, at the age of 17, was admitted to Grandview Hospital in Dayton because of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, where he would die only 5 days later. Now, obviously the kid was depressed, mentally ill, and had terrible parents. However, since this kid had a love for this game, it sets off this crazed moral panic, because like I said, when it comes to these satanic panics, it always follows a pattern. In this case, there's a death. The actual cause of the death is ignored, and then the media gets a hold of it, or the rumor mill. They pick up on a single detail of what the problem actually might be, and they run wild with it. But the actual fact of the matter is, there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever to link his death to this game. Hell, in fact, this game was probably one of the few outlets he had for creativity or fun in life. But now it's out there in the media, it's all over television, it's all over daytime television. Dungeons and Dragons is evil, and if your kids play it, they might be in a satanic cult and all this stuff. And this all gets the attention of a complete and total whack job named Patricia Pulling. And I have no problem with calling this woman a complete and total whack job, because she is the epitome of everything that is wrong about that right-wing conservative Christian America. So this woman was an anti-occult campaigner from Richmond, Virginia. She was like this self-appointed so-called expert on anything satanic or evil or whatever. That typical mindset of whatever I believe is right and whatever you believe is wrong. Now, Pulling, she had a son named Irving who was in kind of this after-school program where they would hang out and play board games and whatever, and Dungeons and Dragons just happened to be part of that rotation of board games. It was all organized by his principal, and it was just this program for children who were just looking to stay out of trouble. However, for some reason, probably mental illness, probably depression, depression. We don't know what goes through young teenagers' minds sometimes. The kid tragically commits suicide by shooting himself in the chest. And I'll give you that. That is a tragedy that no mother should ever endure. They should never have to see their kid commit suicide. I get it. However, the actions she takes afterwards are extreme and unhinged. They are not based in reality at all. So instead of really trying to figure out why her son killed himself, most likely mental illness, she comes to the conclusion somehow that it's because of the board game Dungeons and Dragons, and she somehow comes to the conclusion that it was the boy's principal who put a Dungeons and Dragons curse on him, which caused him to commit suicide. And she goes on to file a wrongful death lawsuit against this principal. And rightfully so, that lawsuit is thrown out of the court. It's like, we feel bad for you, lady. Yeah, that sucks, but your son didn't die because of some curse from Dungeons and Dragons. You're crazy. Go away. She also files a lawsuit against TSR Inc., which was D&D's publishers at the time, and they basically tell her the same thing. The lawsuits were dismissed. However, instead of just moving on with her life or whatever, she decides to double down on all of this. I think it was pride or some kind of mental illness. I don't know. So she founds this one-woman advocacy group called BAD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, and she goes about publishing all this information and circulating this belief that D&D encouraged devil worship and suicide. And obviously our old friend the media latches onto it and exacerbates everything. They call her an expert on devil worship and they consult her on all these shows. She even appears on 60 Minutes, and she literally describes Dungeons and Dragons as a, quote, a fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex, perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, satanic-type rituals, gambling, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summoning, necromantics, divination, and other teachings, end quote. She goes on to be this like self-proclaimed witness. She becomes a consultant to law enforcement on the satanic worship stuff. She shows up as an expert witness in several gaming-related lawsuits, all of which lost in court. And she goes on to attempt to outright ban the game. However, it all ends up kind of backfiring on her. Not only does she never get the game banned or restricted, it becomes more popular than ever, and she becomes kind of a laughingstock and a running joke when it comes to us looking back at the satanic panic of the 1980s. She co-authors this completely unhinged rant of a book on Satanism that makes no sense. Is heavily criticized and filled with contradictions, and it turned out that all of her data was heavily criticized and filled with contradictions. None of it was ever found to be true. However, that was just one of the many sides of the 80s satanic panic. The biggest thing to come out of the satanic panic was actually all started by a woman named Michelle Smith and her husband, formerly her psychiatrist, a man named Lawrence Pazder. Now, Lawrence Pazder, he was just this crazy nutcase psychiatrist who was using this discredited form of trying to recover buried and lost memories by asking these leading questions, which has been discredited in psychiatry. And Michelle was actually one of his patients, and through this weird methodology, she gets all these recovered memories that she was in a satanic cult as a kid and abused and was locked in a basement, and she saw all this child sacrifice and all this crazy stuff. And without going too deep into it, the two write this book called Michelle Remembers, and it's all her memories from growing up in the satanic cult. And it's this instant hit, and it kicks off this panic and fear throughout the 1980s that basically there are all these satanic cults out there that are sacrificing children to Satan. Now, it did turn out that this book was all made up. It was all lies. It was just a cash grab by these two to become rich and famous. But by the time the book is discredited, the damage has already been done. This actually leads to the McMartin preschool trial. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of this trial, just like I didn't go into all the details of the book. This is enough to garner its own episode. But the gist of it is there was this preschool, and this preschool was doing all this demonic evil stuff. They were a satanic cult, and they were using this same bogus method of leading questions to, quote, recover, end quote, memories from these children who were as young as like 3 and 4. And it ended up in these endless lawsuits concerning the parents and these children, and it destroyed the livelihoods of the preschool teachers and the owners of this preschool, all based on the idea or the rumor or the thought that something was happening to these children when no evidence of it was ever found. This actually kind of has an echo with the current satanic panic that's going on in America, especially involving QAnon. When you think of the Pizzagate scandal, it's kind of that same idea. It's an unsubstantiated rumor that gets started, in this case on the internet, that goes wild and causes people to believe all kinds of crazy things. But it was really this book and this lawsuit which led to all these conspiracy theories about these satanic cults which were across America. And that's still kind of an urban legend or a myth or a conspiracy that still lasts to this day, that there are all these underground cults across America that are worshiping the devil and doing human sacrifice and all this crazy stuff. But to be honest, when we actually look into the data, we don't really see any instances of this happening. The closest thing to what we would call a satanic cult or religion is actually the Church of Satan. And to be honest, the Church of Satan doesn't really practice any of that stuff. What they are and what they practice is really more of a humanist type nature of atheism. So essentially this church was founded in San Francisco by Anton LaVey. So LaVey was like this musician in the San Francisco area. He claimed to work for the San Francisco Police Department as a crime scene photographer and as a psychic investigator, but there's no evidence that's ever been found to state that he ever actually did that. And he became somewhat of a local celebrity in San Francisco. He was involved in some paranormal research, and he did these live performances as an organist. He would drive around in like a coroner's van, and he starts to develop this group of friends, and they start talking about like philosophy and the occult and mysticism and all that fun stuff that you talk about. And then they kind of codified that all down into this belief, which became the Church of Satan. Now, they use the word Satan in its original form. They don't actually worship Satan as the antithesis of Christ, but they worship the idea of Satan as the adversary. They kind of worship that adversarial, rebellious nature that questions authority that was really popular in San Francisco at this time. And just to get a glimpse inside some of the beliefs, this comes from one of their members, quote, "We do not believe in the supernatural. To the Satanist, he is his own God. Satan is a symbol of man living as his prideful, carnal nature dictates. Some Satanists extend this symbol to encompass the evolutionary force of entropy that permeates all of nature and provides the drive for survival and propagation inherent in all living things. To the Satanist, Satan is not a conscious entity to be worshipped. Rather, it is a name for the reservoir of power inside each human to be tapped at will," end quote. Essentially, they're saying that man is his own God and that he should live for his own inherent pleasures on earth as long as those pleasures don't harm anybody or anything else. They don't really need God. It starts at atheism. So essentially, in that sense, it's all just a rejection of the traditional Christian church and most supernatural aspects of religion altogether, and an embracement of life and what it is to be human. And all the rituals and stuff like that are all basically just theater. And it's like I said in my episode about secret societies and Skull and Bones, if you're seeing a ritual from the outside and you don't have any context for it, it is going to look demonic or crazy. So when they do their rituals in their context, they understand what's going on, they understand what it means. But in our context, outside of that religion or mindscape, it might look to us like something completely bizarre. However, it kind of gains and maintains its popularity as being outside of the norm and bizarre. It's the poster child for that, and they kind of embrace it because at the end of the day, that's capitalism and that stuff sells. Now, other satanic cults out there, it's really hard to find any kind of data on because they don't really actually exist. I mean, sure, there are individualistic people out there who get together with their buddies and might go like Hail Satan and all this stuff. And there might be like some serial killers out there who believe in that stuff. But the closest real life amalgam of anything I could ever find really comes back to Charles Manson. I mean, Charles Manson, he had some crazy beliefs. He believed that he was the reincarnation of both Jesus and the devil. He believed in these ritualistic orgies and that the Beatles were talking directly to him through Helter Skelter, and that there was going to be a race war and an apocalypse and all this crazy stuff. And I won't dive too deeply into him because I actually have an episode on his life coming up in the future. But that's really the only thing we get that's really close to our idea of a satanic cult in this world. Like, if they do actually exist, it's a group of friends hanging out in a basement reading books about witchcraft and the Necronomicon, and they're probably not even worshiping Satan. They're probably doing something else. I really doubt there's too many people out there that are just worshiping Satan. Here's my soul, give me riches, give me money, give me whatever. Probably not actually happening. Now, a lot of people say that like the inner circle of the Freemasons are worshippers of Satan, or that the Catholic Church in the inner circles, they're all worshiping Satan. And to be honest, they're most likely not. A lot of Freemason practices and stuff out there are available online. Everything they do is public, and despite the fact that it's a secret society, it's pretty much open to anybody. I mean, all you have to do to become a Freemason is go to a Freemason lodge and ask to become one, and they'll welcome you in. They're actually kind of desperate for new membership right now because I think the average age of the Freemason right now is like in their 50s or 60s. A lot of young kids just aren't interested in joining. But like I said, it's probably highly doubtful that there's some satanic cult or cabal that's ruling the world. But that label really just gets attached to people, and it gets attached to people who are outsiders, who are outside of that subculture, outside of that fraternity, outside of that religion, who really don't know anything about what they're talking about. They're self-appointed experts who have generally done no research outside of their own biased echo chambers. And to be honest, the largest victims of these satanic panics aren't the regular people in the suburbs. They're usually the outsiders, the kids that get blamed for everything. The nerds who like D&D and video games, the goths who don't conform to social norms and listen to goth music, which I used to like goth music, but it's gotten so boring the older I get. But it's those people, and especially those teenagers, who really get blamed for perpetuating all this evil Satan worship, who in fact are really just kids who are trying to figure out their own identity and what their interests are in life. And hell, I remember, I'm going back to my high school days. For context, I was in high school from 2000 to 2004. And for context, I went to a very small high school. I think the graduating class was less than 200 kids. But I remember like the kids, even myself, who was interested in like heavy metal and goth and like to wear black and had an interest in other cultures and other religions and enjoyed horror films and all that stuff. I remember other kids in the class looking at them being like, what is wrong with them? Why are they so weird? Or I remember one girl being asked, do you worship Satan because you're wearing all black and you look like you're depressed all the time? And it's really that dynamic right there, that dynamic of somebody's doing something that I don't quite understand, so it has to be evil, that has really in the past exacerbated these satanic panics and even exacerbates it today. Like I said, just like QAnon, people think it's this a cult of billionaires and politicians and musicians and whatever who are all worshiping Satan and trying to bring in the one world order, and I can go on and on because that is an insane rabbit hole. I've tried to stay away from it in the past because I really try to focus on more historic things, but QAnon kind of echoes the satanic panic of the 80s, so it's relevant in this context. But even that shows that the idea, the fear of Satan and satanic cults is alive alive and well with us even to this day. And the media, especially television, film, and nowadays the internet, really exacerbates it. And at the end of the day, there's always going to be people that will buy into that insanity. And with that, I think this is where I'm going to end it for this episode. Now, to be honest, this is a dense subject. I touched on a lot of stuff here. There is an endless amount of source material when it comes to this stuff, and I could go on and on. However, I think that's left best for future episodes where I can really deep dive into some of these subjects. But tell me what you think. What are your thoughts on Satan and the satanic panics of the past and the satanic panics of the future? I will say I haven't started a Discord yet, but I did last night decide to move my YouTube archive of all this from private to public. So the whole back catalog of the series plus this episode is going to be public on YouTube. So feel free to comment there, shoot me an email. My private email address is up on that site. It's literally just urban legend and mythology at youtube.com. It's really easy to find. And as always, if you like what I'm doing, just feel free to share this, share my links, tell a friend, support me through Spotify through that link down in the description. And thank you guys for a wonderful 3 seasons. It has blown me away how much this podcast has grown since last year when I first launched this thing. Now, to be honest, I'm not really making a lot of money off of this. I still have a full-time day job, but your support has made it so I can at least financially cover the costs of this hobby, so that's pretty awesome. And as always, we're not going on hiatus for very long. I'm just taking 3 weeks. I will be back with the season 1 premiere in February. And in the interim, I'm going to be releasing some like bonus episodes and stuff I have archived just to kind of get them out of this memory or hard drive here on this computer. Now, to be honest, that stuff's not really going to be edited. It's just going to be raw, but if you enjoy it, have fun with it. But in the meantime, I'm going to edit this episode and I will see you in season 4.